Hi, I'm Michelle Gordon. I'm a senior lecturer at Emory University in the Department of African American Studies. And today I'm here with my student, Erin.
Hi, my name is Erin Oquindo, and I'm a senior in the college majoring in American Studies and minoring in English.
So Erin, you once told me that you felt like there's no one on campus who can identify fully with your whole self. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how that experience has influenced your journey into or through interdisciplinary studies.
Yeah, absolutely. My home life and my sort of childhood growing up was very unique. So my dad immigrated to the U.S. from the Philippines in his early 20s, and my mom is from the Midwest in Illinois. And I grew up right smack dab in the middle of Tennessee. So I grew up around a lot of people who didn't look like me, didn't grow up in similar family settings to me, didn't have the same culture as I did at home. And so when I was looking at colleges, I was really interested in finding a sense of community with people who may or may not have had similar experiences growing up and felt similar ways about themselves, both racially, culturally, and in a number of different categories as well. When I came to Emory, I actually started at the Oxford College campus. I found that it was one of the most diverse spaces I had ever been in my life, but at the same time couldn't really find people that really identified fully with my experiences. And that may either be because they were of a different race than me, or a different racial mix from me, or grew up in different types of communities. But whatever the reason, I really found that there was no one person or no group of people that could fully identify with everything I had ever felt or struggled with sort of growing up as a multiracial person in the American South. And so I channeled kind of that search for community into my own scholarship. I started doing a lot of work researching current events and history of the Philippines, as well as doing some work on just race studies and multiracial studies, and found through that interdisciplinary studies and American studies as its own sort of course of scholarship in which I could pull from a lot of different elements, like thematic elements, and pull from history and sociology and lots of different things to sort of piece together a form of scholarship that I fully identified with, not only as a student, but also just as who I am. And that's kind of how I came to where I am in the American Studies department.
That's really interesting. I feel like I had a somewhat similar experience growing up in the South, very different time period, but that my life experiences didn't quite match the narrative of the post-civil rights era, where everyone says, oh, we have overcome, we are the perfect melting pot. And I kept wondering, then why does everyone care so much?
Right.
And I started asking different questions, and I think like you, it sort of pushed me to think beyond the narrowness of racial categories in American history and looking in different disciplines and arenas and ways to explain all of these different sort of phenomenon. But I think the South had something to do with it, and I'm sure it's a similar regionally influenced experience for anyone in different places. But I think for me too, I needed that multiplicity of disciplines to get at a real understanding of something that seemed to actually influence so many different facets of society and experience. So how did you find community for yourself outside of academia on campus, if you felt like you were sort of struggling to find the perfect place or way to fit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, honestly, in something really unique about Emory and something really great about going to school in the South as well is the really rich and intense and incredible activism that happens here. And I think through that, I was really able to find community with people who sort of had not necessarily similar backgrounds, but similar missions to me. I think allyship and coalitions are a really great way for people to find community with people with different backgrounds. So for myself, I actually sort of came into a lot of my extracurricular activity via my own academic journey. I was in a class called Memoir in Prison my second year at Oxford College, And through that, we worked a lot with women who were incarcerated at Leandria State Prison. And I got really involved with sort of prison reform, and then beyond that, ideas of prison abolition and rethinking sort of the way that we have set up a lot of systems in our American society, and in local societies as well. And through that, I found a lot of people who sort of had a similar bent for social justice as I did, and finding how they personally came to their own activism was a huge part in myself finding that I could find community with people in ways other than them having the exact same home life as me. So finding out that someone's equally as passionate as I am about racial justice and about sort of understanding kind of the racial binaries that you were talking about in order to sort of deconstruct them for whatever reason they may have, was really helpful for me in finding community outside of the classroom.
We've been talking before about diversity in education and what can mixed race experience or conversations help bring to the table. And I remember you telling me you didn't think diversity really was different faces or different categories of people on its own, that it also had to include uncomfortable conversations. So what kinds of uncomfortable conversations do you think your mixed race perspective or experience has brought to the table among your peers or in classrooms, and thinking about what is diversity and how that is a pathway to or an obstruction to excellence?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest elements of us sort of deconstructing our ideas of race as sort of this fixed, rigid thing is also reconstructing our idea of implementing diversity programs into universities, right? And I think you said it perfectly. I don't think that diversity is just different faces existing in a room together. I think it's those faces having really difficult conversations about how unique those experiences are and how they're influenced by different things like racial makeup or mix, by experiences, by environment, by communities that they may or may not have had, and how that affects their lives either as students, as faculty, as staff, as members in general of an educational community. I think having critical conversations about that is really important, not only to make the university an inclusive space for all people, not just people who fit into these racial binaries that I think we've constructed really rigid ideas around, but also just deconstructing those binaries in general. I think is really helpful for us to take a more critical look at race and why we find it so important, and why it has shaped so many things in America, but also just globally. And those experiences are all unique as well. And I think being a multiracial person in a university setting has allowed me, I think, to have more of a almost bird's eye view perspective of the ways in which we implement diversity or try to implement diversity in a university setting, whether that be through Emory specifically or on a broader sense. But I think knowing that being multiracial goes beyond kind of this post-racial, best of both worlds, we are a melting pot narrative, and really digs into, well, let's have critical conversations about identity and liminal space between identities, and where multiracial people fall in that liminal space is really important to having conversations of understanding, of growth, of education between people of all races, all ethnicities, and all backgrounds as they go on their own personal journeys of education to whatever path that may lead them to.
Yeah, I think for me that element of binaries and breaking down binaries has been one of the most valuable parts of thinking through mixed race experience in a US context, whether that's in slavery, in the period of segregation, or like you said, the supposedly post-racial era of the 21st century. And mixed race existence on its own breaks down those perceived binaries of black or white, which already are too narrow to confine all of American identities and experience. And pushing, having that, I like what you said about that bird's eye perspective. It's not necessarily a perfect perspective, but it's a different perspective that sees where the logics and the theories and the categories we're taught as being natural are not necessarily quite so fixed and quite so rigid. I was wondering if you could say just a little bit about some of the kind of specific research you've done in the area and what that's taught you in terms of thinking about scholarship or research, or just critically thinking about the world beyond the categories or ways that you're normally taught to view it.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research on multiracial identities in fiction narratives specifically. And I did that for a number of different reasons, one of which being sort of breaking down racial binaries like we spoke about before by adding stories to those conversations, but at the same time sort of validating alternative sources to doing so, right? We have talked a little bit in classes that I've had with you about how statistics and sheer numbers and sociology alone isn't the full picture. And we've spoken a little bit about something called the value of the so-called exception, right? And I think that personal narratives and personally constructive narratives like fiction are really helpful in compiling a series of stories that are valuable because they exist. And I think one of the greatest things about multiraciality and mixed race studies is the idea that your story matters because it's yours, right? And my story matters because it's mine. And expanding that idea to every area of scholarship, maybe more specifically in the humanities, but I think it's universally applicable, right? That seeing someone's extremely unique experience as a multiracial person can help us think a little bit more about, well, there have to be these types of exceptions in other spaces as well, right? And opening your eyes and opening your ears and your mind and your scholarship to all of that, I think is always really helpful for us moving forward.
Well, thank you, Erin. I so enjoyed visiting with you today and hope you enjoyed our conversation.